Predictive brain processing is a fundamental principle of how your nervous system generates experience, and it challenges the common assumption that you simply perceive the world as it is. Instead, your brain is constantly building internal models of reality based on past experiences and then using incoming sensory information to update or refine those models. What you consciously experience is the result of this interaction between prediction and input. At any given moment, your brain is making educated guesses about what is happening around you. These predictions are formed from prior knowledge, learned patterns, and contextual cues. Sensory input from your eyes, ears, and body is then compared against these predictions. If the input matches the expectation, the brain doesn't need to do much additional processing, which saves energy. If there's a mismatch, what's called a prediction error occurs, and the brain updates its model to better align with reality. This process is happening continuously and largely outside of conscious awareness. It allows you to navigate the world efficiently, but it also means that your perception is inherently biased by your past. For example, if you've had repeated positive experiences in a certain environment, your brain will predict safety and familiarity there. If you've had negative experiences, it may predict threat or discomfort, even if the current situation is neutral. One important implication of this is that perception is not purely objective. Two people can encounter the same situation and perceive it differently because their brains are operating with different predictive models. These models are shaped over time by culture, upbringing, emotional experiences, and repeated behaviors. This is why disagreements about what actually happened can arise. Each person is interpreting the same sensory data through a different internal framework. Attention also plays a key role in this system. What you focus on influences which predictions are prioritized and which sensory inputs are amplified. If your attention is directed toward potential threats, your brain becomes more sensitive to cues that confirm that expectation. If it's directed toward opportunities or rewards, the same environment can feel entirely different. In this way, attention acts as a filter that shapes your experience in real time. There's also a strong connection between predictive processing and emotion. Emotions can be understood as part of the brain's way of signaling how well predictions are being met. When things align with expectations, you may feel a sense of ease or satisfaction. When there's a significant mismatch, especially in ways that suggest potential harm, the brain generates stress or anxiety to prompt corrective action. Over time, these predictive models can become more rigid or more flexible depending on how they are used. Repeatedly reinforcing the same interpretations can strengthen certain patterns, making them more automatic. On the other hand, exposure to new experiences and deliberate shifts in perspective can update these models, allowing for a broader and more adaptable way of perceiving the world. This has direct implications for how you experience life. Because your brain is constantly predicting, you are not just reacting to reality, you are actively shaping it. The expectations you carry, the environments you choose, and the patterns you reinforce all contribute to the neurochemistry of meaning, and motivation determines what feels important in your life. And this is governed by a set of chemical systems that assign value to your experiences. Among the most influential are dopamine and serotonin, along with other neuromodulators that shape mood, drive, and emotional tone. These systems don't just respond to the world, they actively guide your behavior by signaling what is worth pursuing and what is not. Dopamine plays a central role in motivation and goal-directed behavior. It is released when you anticipate reward or detect progress towards something meaningful. Importantly, it is not just about pleasure. It's about the drive to move toward an outcome. When dopamine levels increase in response to certain activities or goals, those behaviors become more likely to be repeated. Over time, this creates patterns of action that align with what your brain has learned to value. What makes this system highly individual is that dopamine responses are shaped by experience. The activities, environments, and achievements that trigger strong dopamine release for one person may not have the same effect on another. This is because your brain has learned through repetition and context what constitutes reward or progress. As a result, your sense of purpose is not universal. It emerges from the specific ways your brain has been conditioned to assign value. Serotonin contributes in a different but complementary way. It is often associated with mood, well-being, and a sense of stability. While dopamine drives pursuit, serotonin is more related to satisfaction and contentment. It helps regulate how you feel about your current state, including your social standing and overall sense of balance. When serotonin levels are well regulated, there is a greater sense of calm and confidence, which supports sustained engagement with long-term goals. The interaction between these systems is critical. Too much focus on dopamine-driven pursuit without sufficient serotonin balance can lead to a constant feeling of chasing without satisfaction. On the other hand, high serotonin without enough dopamine can reduce motivation and make it harder to initiate action. A functional balance allows you to both strive toward meaningful goals and experience a sense of fulfillment along the way. There's also an important role for context and environment in shaping these neurochemical responses. External stimuli, such as social feedback, novelty, and even digital inputs, can artificially elevate dopamine levels. While this can feel rewarding in the short term, it can also reduce sensitivity to slower, more effort-based rewards. This is why activities that require sustained effort, like learning a skill or building something over time, can feel less engaging if the brain is privy to rapid, high-intensity stimulation. Meaning, in this framework is not something abstract or purely philosophical. It is closely tied to the patterns of activation in these neurochemical systems. When your actions consistently align with what your brain has learned to value, you experience a sense of purpose. When there is a mismatch, when you are engaged in activities that do not trigger meaningful reinforcement, motivation tends to decline. Over time, these systems can be shaped intentionally. By repeatedly engaging in behaviors that are aligned with long-term goals and reducing reliance on low-effort, high-stimulation inputs, you can recalibrate what your brain finds rewarding. This process gradually shifts your baseline, making it easier to find motivation and meaning in activities that support growth and sustained engagement. Subjective time perception is a powerful but often unnoticed factor in how you experience life, because your brain does not measure time in a fixed, objective way. Instead, it constructs the sense of time based on attention, emotional intensity, and the amount of information being processed. This means that the same amount of clock time can feel dramatically different depending on your internal state and the context you are in. When you are highly engaged in an activity, something that demands focus or feels meaningful, time often appears to pass quickly in the moment. This is because your attentional systems are fully occupied and the brain is not tracking time as a separate variable. In contrast, when you are bored or understimulated, attention drifts, and you become more aware of the passage of time, which makes it feel slower and more drawn out. However, there is an interesting reversal when you look back on experiences. Periods filled with novelty, challenge, or emotional significance tend to feel longer in retrospect. This is because the brain encodes more information during those moments. Memory formation is denser, with more distinct events and details stored. When you later recall that period, it appears expanded, as if more life was packed into it. In contrast, repetitive or routine periods often feel like they passed quickly in hindsight because fewer unique memories were formed. This dynamic highlights the role of novelty. New experiences force the brain to pay closer attention and update its internal models, which increases the richness of encoding. This is why traveling, learning new skills, or encountering unfamiliar situations can make time feel more substantial. The brain is effectively sampling more data, which enhances both the immediate experience and the memory of it. Emotion also plays a significant role. High arousal states, whether positive or negative, can alter time perception. In stressful or threatening situations, time can seem to slow down. This is likely due to increased activity in systems related to attention and survival, allowing the brain to process information more rapidly in critical moments. On the other hand, positive emotional states associated with engagement and flow can compress the sense of time, creating the feeling that hours have passed in what seems like minutes. There's also a link between time perception and dopamine. When you are making progress toward a goal or experiencing rewarding stimuli, dopamine levels increase, which can influence how time is perceived. This often results in a more fluid and less rigid sense of time, particularly during activities that are both challenging and rewarding. Importantly, your perception of time contributes to your overall sense of how full or meaningful your life feels. If your days are dominated by repetitive, low-engagement activities, they may blur together, creating the impression that time is passing quickly without much substance. In contrast, periods that include variation, challenge, and intentional engagement tend to feel richer and more memorable. This means that how you structure your attention and experiences has a direct impact on your subjective lifespan, not in terms of actual years, but in how expansive those years feel. By increasing moments of novelty, focus, and emotional engagement, you effectively alter the density of your experience, making time feel more substantial and less fleeting. The constructed sense of self is not a fixed entity located in a single part of the brain, but an ongoing process generated by the interaction of multiple neural systems. What you experience as you, your identity, your continuity over time, your sense of ownership over thoughts and actions, is assembled moment to moment from memory, sensory input, and internal bodily signals. At the center of this process are networks often associated with self-referential thinking, particularly those that integrate past experiences with present awareness. These networks continuously link what is happening now with what has happened before, creating a narrative that feels stable and coherent. This is why you experience yourself as the same person across time, even though the underlying neural activity is constantly changing. Memory plays a critical role in this construction. Your brain stores representations of past events, but these are not exact recordings. Each time you recall something, it is reconstructed, influenced by your current state and context. These reconstructed memories are then reintegrated into your sense of identity. Over time, this creates a personal narrative, a story about who you are, what you value, and how you relate to the world. There's also a strong contribution from interoception, which is your brain's ability to sense the internal state of your body. Signals related to heart rate, breathing, and visceral sensations are continuously fed into the brain and contribute to your sense of being a physical embodied self. This is what creates the feeling that your experiences are happening to you rather than just occurring in isolation. Another important component is agency, the sense that you are the one initiating and controlling your actions. This arises from predictive processes in the brain that anticipate the outcomes of your movements and decisions. When your actions align with these predictions, you experience a sense of control. When there is a mismatch, such as when something happens unexpectedly, that sense of agency can be disrupted. What makes the sense of self particularly interesting is its flexibility. While it feels stable, it can shift based on context, attention, and experience. For example, in highly focused states or certain forms of meditation, the usual narrative sense of self can become quieter, and experience feels less centered around a personal identity. In other situations, such as social interactions or moments of evaluation, the sense of self can become more pronounced and even exaggerated. This flexibility indicates that the self is not a single permanent structure, but a dynamic process that the brain updates continuously. It is shaped by the environments you are in, the roles you occupy, and the patterns of thought you repeat. Over time, certain aspects of identity can become more dominant simply because they are reinforced more often. Understanding the self in this way has important implications. It means that while you cannot instantly change who you are not entirely fixed either. The patterns that make up your identity can be influenced gradually through changes in behavior, attention, and experience. The sense of continuity remains, but the content of that continuity can evolve as the brain updates its internal model of who you are in relation to the world. Memory reconstruction is a central mechanism that shapes how you experience your life, because what you think of as your past is not a fixed record, but an active, ongoing process. Each time you recall an event, your brain does not simply retrieve a stored file. Instead, it rebuilds the memory using fragments of stored information, current context, and your present emotional state. This reconstructed version is then stored again, often slightly altered from the original. This means that memory is inherently dynamic. Details can be strengthened, weakened, or modified over time, depending on how often they are recalled and under what conditions. Emotional tone, in particular, plays a powerful role. If you repeatedly revisit a memory while in a negative state, the memory can become more strongly associated with that emotion. Conversely, recalling the same event in a different context can gradually shift its meaning and emotional impact. At the neural level, this process involves interactions between the hippocampus, which is critical for forming and retrieving memories, and various cortical regions that store different aspects of the experience, such as sensory details, language, and emotional associations. When a memory is reactivated, it temporarily becomes unstable, a process known as reconsolidation. During this window, the memory can be updated before being stored again. This updating process is not a flaw. It is an adaptive feature. It allows your brain to integrate new information and adjust your understanding of past events. For example, something that once felt confusing or threatening can later be reinterpreted with more context or knowledge, reducing its emotional intensity. In this way, your past is continuously being shaped to better align with your current understanding of the world. However, this also means that memory is susceptible to distortion. External influences, suggestions, and even your own expectations can alter how events are remembered. Over time, these changes can accumulate, creating a version of the past that feels accurate but may differ significantly from what originally occurred. This has implications not just for personal reflection, but also for how people interpret shared experiences and disagreements about what happened. Memory reconstruction plays a major role in identity because your sense of self is largely built from the narrative of your past. The stories you tell yourself about your experiences, what they meant, how they shaped you, and what they say about who you are all based on these reconstructed memories. If those interpretations shift, your sense of identity can shift as well. There's also a link between memory and future behavior. The brain uses past experiences to predict future outcomes, guiding decisions and expectations. If your memories emphasize failure or negative outcomes, your predictions may become more cautious or avoidant. If they emphasize learning and adaptation, you may approach future situations with more flexibility and confidence. Attention and repetition influence which memories become more dominant. The more you revisit certain experiences or narratives, the more strongly they are encoded and integrated into your identity. This means that what you choose to focus on over time can shape not just how you remember the past, but how you experience the present and anticipate the future. The neural basis of life and death can be understood through the presence or absence of organized brain activity that generates subjective experience. What you perceive as being alive, your thoughts, sensations, emotions, and sense of self is not produced by a single structure, but by coordinated activity across multiple brain systems working in real time. As long as this activity is maintained in a sufficiently integrated way, experience continues. At any given moment, networks in the brain are exchanging information through electrical and chemical signals. These include systems involved in sensory processing, memory, attention, and internal regulation. The brainstem plays a particularly important role in maintaining basic arousal and wakefulness, while cortical and subcortical networks contribute to the richness and content of experience. Together, these systems create what feels like a continuous, unified awareness. A key feature of this process is integration. It's not just that neurons are active, but that their activity is coordinated in patterns that allow information to be combined and interpreted. This integration allows you to experience a coherent world rather than a collection of disconnected signals. When this coordination is disrupted, such as in deep sleep, anesthesia, or certain medical conditions, conscious experience can diminish or temporarily disappear, even though some neural activity is still present. Life, from a neuroscientific perspective, includes the ongoing capacity for this organized activity to occur. It involves not just the presence of brain function, but the ability of that function to sustain awareness and responsiveness. This is why different states of consciousness exist along a spectrum, from full alertness to unconsciousness, depending on how these systems are operating. Death represents the point at which the neural processes required for generating experience irreversibly cease. When the brain can no longer maintain the activity and integration necessary for consciousness, the subjective experience that defines being alive comes to an end. This is not a gradual fading within experience itself, but rather the termination of the process that produces experience. One important distinction is between biological processes that can continue briefly in the presence of conscious awareness. In some cases, certain cellular or physiological functions may persist for a short time after the loss of coordinated brain activity. However, without the integrated neural signaling required for awareness, there's no subjective experience occurring during that period. This perspective also highlights how dependent your experience is on the physical state of the brain. Changes in oxygen levels, blood flow, or neurochemical balance can rapidly alter consciousness. This is evident in situations like fainting, where a temporary disruption in blood flow to the brain leads to a brief loss of awareness, followed by recovery once normal conditions are restored. Understanding life and death in this way brings attention back to the present moment of experience. The continuity you feel is not guaranteed independently of the underlying biology. It is actively generated and maintained. Each moment of awareness depends on the ongoing function of these systems, which are constantly adapting to internal and external conditions. In this framework, your experience of life is the direct expression of neural activity organized in a specific way, and death marks the end of that organization. What feels like a stable, continuous self is actually the result of dynamic processes that persist only as long as the brain is able to sustain them. Understanding life and death in this way brings attention back to the present moment of experience. The continuity you feel is not guaranteed independently of the underlying biology. It is actively generated and maintained. Each moment of awareness depends on the ongoing function of these systems, which are constantly adapting to internal and external conditions. In this framework, your experience of life is the direct expression of neural activity organized in a specific way, and death marks the end of that organization. What feels like a stable, continuous self is actually the result of dynamic processes that persist only as long as the brain is able to sustain them. What this ultimately points to is the importance of how you engage with the time and awareness you do have. Because your experience is actively generated and not fixed, the way you direct attention, interpret events, and shape your internal state has real consequences for the quality of your life. The biology sets the boundaries, but within those boundaries, there is room to influence how vividly, meaningfully, and consciously you experience each moment.